everyone. Thanks for coming. Today we're welcoming a talk from Dr. Tom Rossing, who we're very happy to have talk about bells, which is a hot topic at CCRMA this year. Dr. Rossing is a fellow of the Acoustical Society America and a fellow of the American Physical Society, among other societies, IEEE, and really highly prolific, written over 17 books, is that right, on acoustics and the physics of string instruments. I've used this one during my undergraduate. It's one of the first ones I found at Michigan. So without further ado, thank you, and let's welcome Tom Rossing.
Thank you. Before I start the talk, I'd like to share a clipping with you. At my age, what's the first thing you read when the New York Times comes? Well, the obituaries, of course. And this one says, Ramo D. Belli is dead at 88. Drumhead set, rocks beat. But I'm sure you've all heard of Ramo. Perhaps some of you have met him in person. I had the privilege of doing some consulting for the Ramo company a couple of years ago. And I remember Ramo is a very personable fellow. He was as proud of his wines that he grew down in Paso Robles as he was of his drums. And I think I still have a bottle of his wine. So if there's a real occasion here at CCRMA, we could celebrate with a bottle of Ramo Belli wine, right? Well, today I'm taking a trip back to the past. I haven't really thought much about bells for many years, but for a long while I was hooked on them. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about bells while I watch the clock. Now, if you want to see the largest of anything, you go to Russia, right? And that's true of bells. This is the Tsar Kolokol, which is over 200 tons. It's still I guess, the biggest bell ever cast. Nobody's ever heard it, although Chris, I guess, thinks he's going to synthesize it. Good luck. No. When you get bells, well, it was supposed to hang in the tower of Ivan the Terrible in the Kremlin. But bells of this size are usually cast below ground. You dig a pit and you make the mold below ground. And that's what they did with this. And the casting went just fine. The metal was poured and it was cooling, but it had a wooden scaffold around it, and fire broke out in that scaffold. Well, of course, that wouldn't really have hurt the bell. It had been molten bronze, but some overzealous fire people turned the hose on it. And that's the result. A 12.7 ton chunk broke out of it, so nobody has ever heard it. They didn't feel like recasting it. So it stands in the Kremlin. It's quite a tourist site. Well, if you want to see the oldest of anything, you go to China, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some ancient Chinese bells. That's where we get the old part of the title. Now, you don't have to go very far to see some very fine bells, just over here to the Hoover Tower, where we have a 48-bell carillon that is played, well, I don't think it's played nearly often enough, but it will be played at commencement time. And I'm sure you've all heard it. And of course, you can go up the tower and watch the carillioner perform. We'll talk more about bell playing after we've talked about bell acoustics. Okay, when the clapper hits a bell, you get a sequence of events, and that sequence of events makes a nice sound, and which we can analyze in terms of normal modes of vibration of the bell. And just to refresh your mind, I had some of you in class, but just to remind all of you, if you have a circular plate, the lowest mode of vibration is the one in which the entire plate moves in the same direction. Not to the same amplitude, but in the same direction. And then at a little higher frequency, you have a nodal line down the center, so the two halves of the bell vibrate in opposite phase. And then you have a mode with two nodal lines and with a nodal circle. And so you can characterize the modes of vibration of a plate by giving the number of nodal diameters and the number of nodal circles. And that's what I've done down here in this cartoon. The first number, M, we'll be referring to it in some later text, is the number of nodal meridians, and N is the number of nodal circles. In fact, this is one way you can make the modes of vibration of a flat plate like this visible by sprinkling some powder on it. This, I guess, was salt. We painted the plate black and sprinkled salt on it for nice contrast, and then drove it at the modal frequencies that would give these patterns. All right, you can use your imagination a little bit and think what would happen if you took this plate and bent it over, made a bell out of it. What were the nodal meridians would now be meridians that go up one side of the bell and down the other. And we still have nodal circles. The lowest mode of vibration of a large church bell or carillon bell has no nodal circles, but it has two nodal meridians that go up and over the top of the bell. So this moves out, this moves in. Each section of the bell on opposite sides of the null meridian move in opposite directions. There are a pair of modes that have one nodal circle. The prime, which is a very significant one, we'll talk about that momentarily, and the minor third, which is also very important in the tonality of the bell. The only difference between them really is that the location of the nodal circle. In the case of the prime, it's located just above the sound bow, where the clapper strikes. In the case of the minor third, it's located at the waist of the bell. And then we have another pair of modes. Well, in fact, in order to distinguish between the modes that have the nodal circle low down and at the waist, I've made label these as the 1 star, n equals 1 star. So we have a 3-1 star, and we have 4-1 and a 4-1 star, and so forth, and so on. You'll see a lot of the modes here in a moment. All right, on this cartoon, you see the same thing. We've added a view at the mouth of the bell. So you see the 2-0 mode and the 2-1 mode have two nodal meridians that go up over the top of the bell, and so they intersect the bottom of the bell, the mouth of the bell, at 4 places. And you get a pattern. It goes from being a circle to being an ellipse to being a circle to being an ellipse in the other direction. And the 3-1, 3-1 star have 3 nodal meridians, so there are 6 of these nodal spots, and so on, 8, and so on the line. And then we continue on. Below these cartoons are given the relative frequencies, the frequencies compared to the strike note. I haven't told you much about the strike note yet. I will. The strike note is the pitch that you assign to the bell, and it may or may not correspond to an actual mode. It may be purely a virtual pitch. We'll talk about that too. So down here we've got the approximate ratio of the modal frequency to the strike note. This hum, the lowest mode, has about half the frequency of the strike note. The prime is very close to the strike note. It doesn't actually have that much to do with determining the strike note, But in a well-tuned bell, it corresponds pretty much to the frequency of the strike note. The tierce, or the minor third, is 20% greater, and then the quint, or the major fifth, or perfect fifth, has a ratio 1.5, and so on. So these red numbers below the cartoons are the relative frequencies of that mode compared to the strike note, okay? Or playing a game like you have, well, I'm used to talking in physics labs and say, well, we got a periodic chart of the atoms up there, so we ought to have a periodic chart of the bell modes. But we've got a periodic chart of the bell modes on the screen. And I'm following the lead of Anderlecht, who has spent his life studying bells, probably knew more. He's no longer with us, but he probably knew more about bells than any other human being on the planet. And he separated these into groups, group 1, group 2, group 3. Now the 3-0 mode, for example, really is kind of a hybrid. It belongs in group 1, but so does this mode. And so I've put it in between group 1 and group 2 for reasons that we'll see. So we can make a big chart like this to hang in the lecture hall with the modes, periodic table of the bell modes. Or we can plot the modal frequencies on a graph like this. The vertical axis here is frequency, and the horizontal axis is the M, which, remember, was the number of nodal meridians. And then all the modes in group 1 that had 2 nodal circles are along this line, and 3 along this line, and 4. We can get an orderly chart of modes like this. Now these green lines over here point to acoustically significant modes. In fact, as you'll find, these are the 3 that determine the strike note. These 3 modes on the frequency axis are almost equally spaced, and it's a logarithmic frequency axis. So these 3 determine the strike note. Then there are other notes that determine a secondary strike note. We'll get to that in due time. But it's a fascinating study to study the acoustics of the bells and what we hear and what gives rise to those. Well, I've been fortunate to visit a number of bell foundries. This particular photo I took at the Ijsbots foundry in Holland. And this shows the tuning operation. After the bell is cast almost to the final shape, but it needs a little bit of tuning to bring the various modes into an exact harmonic relationship. And that tuning is done on a vertical lathe, like this chap is doing. So after you're through the tuning operation, this is what you hope to end up with. This is the tuning and temperament of a D4 bell. Here are the note names of the partials that correspond to those modes of vibrations. Here are the frequencies of the just tuning, ideal just tuning, the tuning to equal temperament, and they're somewhere in between. They're close to both of them. And this is the bell that I just showed you, and these are the numbers. We won't dwell on that in detail. But, okay, what about the strike note of the bell? That's the pitch that almost everyone hears. It's a subjective note. It's what we call virtual pitch. And it's determined by 3 modes that I showed you that are almost harmonic in frequency. And the ear, when you hear a complex tone, you the ear searches for a common denominator, common multiple, that it can use to assign the pitch. And these three modes that I pointed out, 4-1, 5-1, and 6-1, are almost harmonic in a well-tuned bell. And so nearly everybody zeroes in on the missing fundamental of those three. Now, it's interesting, Andre Lair, who I mentioned, who spent his life tuning bells, kind of chuckles and says, he doesn't hear that strike note. He hears the individual partials. He's so used to listening analytically that it's very difficult for him to shift into a Gestalt mode. Some of you who took 150 know that demonstration I did do where you can hear two different pitches depending upon whether you listen analytically or in a Gestalt mode. In fact, it's kind of analogous to the optical illusion of the staircase. So you can either pretend that you're looking up at a staircase or down at a staircase. And most people can shift back and forth, but perhaps prefer one or the other. Well, a graduate student at the Technical University in Eindhoven, Barry Ecken, did a study to nail down exactly which partials determined the strike note. And in these little mini graphs, he shows what happens when you change the frequency. The frequency acts delta F over F. Here's delta F over is 0 at the center. If you raise the frequency, you go to the right up to 10%. If you lower the frequency, you go to the left. Well, some of these modes change very markedly in pitch. For instance, the octave, the nominal, changes about half as much. If the frequency changes by 10%, the pitch changes by a frequency equivalent to 5%. That's a strong determinant of the strike tone. The fifth has almost no effect. You can mistune that and it hardly changes the strike note. Same way with the minor third and the prime. Well, the prime has a little bit of dependence and the hum. But you get over here, the next one that, or the other two that have a strong effect on the pitch of the strike note are the upper octave, 6-1 mode, and the 12th, 5-1 mode. These have a strong dependence of pitch. So this sort of verifies what I claimed when we showed the graph, that the strike note of a well-tuned bell is really determined by the near harmonicity or exact harmonicity of those three partials. Stop me if you have questions along the way. Okay, the sound radiation. That's an interesting study. Each of these modes of vibration that you excite when you strike the bell with the clapper decays at, well, its own rate, at its own speed. Some decay faster than others. There's damping due to radiation, and there's damping internally in the bell bronze. And so the partials decay at different rates. Note the hum, which is the lowest mode of vibration, has the slowest decay rate. And so if you strike a bell and you let it ring for a bit, after a while you hear only the hum. And each of the modes has a different decay rate. Also, each of them has a different sound radiation pattern. You know that those of you who have sat through some of my lectures before know that I keep emphasizing that fact, that every instrument has its own characteristic radiation patterns, so that everybody in concert hall here's a different concert. Now, it's true that in a concert hall you've got reflections off the wall, ceiling, and floor that tend to de-emphasize the radiation pattern, the maxima and minima of the radiation pattern. But from the instrument, or if you hear it outside, and most people hear a carillon outside, this is the pattern of the radiation, fourfold symmetry, sixfold, and so on. Each one has its own characteristic symmetry. Well, carillonneurs and people that study bells have speculated for quite some time what would happen if you tuned the bell to a slightly different recipe. Instead of having that very dominating minor third, what if you made that a major third above the strike note? But nobody could really figure out a way to do that, because if you change the third partial, raise it from 1.2 to 1.25, you muck up all the other partials. You change the bell completely. Well, a team at the Technical University in Eindhoven used finite element methods to study the bell, get the details of the way the bell behaved, and they decided that with using a program for structural analysis, they could change that minor third to a major third and not greatly affect the other partials. And they did. I actually participated in a psychoacoustical experiment to just before they went ahead and cast bells to see that that would be so to the listener. And what we did was take the sound of a very well-tuned Hemini bell. You know, a Hemini bell is to, or Hemini is to bells as Stradivari is to violins. If a town in the Low Countries or somewhere says they have a set of Hemini bells, you know they're very, very good bells. They were the master tuners. Well, we recorded a Hemini bell and then filtered out the minor third, and then resynthesized it with a major third. So what the listeners were listening to was 90% or 95% real bell with only one partial changed slightly. And the results of the experiment were, I think, interesting, perhaps predictable, but interesting. The carillonneurs, professional carillonneurs that listen, well, then we used those synthesized bells to synthesize a simple tune on the carillon. And the carillonneurs, almost all of them preferred the bells, the tune played in bells with the minor third tuning. The musicians, experienced musicians who weren't carillonneurs, hadn't spent half their life playing carillons, preferred the minor third bells for a tune in a minor key and the major third bells for a tune in a major key. The guy on the street that had very little musical experience preferred the major third tuning in both major and minor pieces. There's less clashing of in the chords. Well, with that information, then the Eisbouts people went ahead and cast a bell. Now, in fact, they ended up with from the computer program, from the finite element analysis, with two bell shapes that would have a minor third, or a major third. Here they are, a green one and a blue one. Here's the traditional minor third bell. And they made both of them, and they both seem to work. Here's a picture of a major third bell and a minor third bell. This is the traditional bell that we're used to seeing, and this is the one of the major third bells. It's got a kind of a pot belly, I guess. In fact,
Are you going to play an example?
Pardon?
Are you going to play an example?
I've got them on tapes, but I don't think I have time to play them for you, but I'll play them for you sometime. Now, the Eisbots people have made several carillons with major third bells. There's one in Los Angeles at the is it the Crystal Palace? They've got a major third carillon. There's one carillon in Virginia that belongs to the what's the name of the organization that has both major third and minor third bells in the carillon, so the carillonneur can have his choice. It's the only one I know of that's a double carillon like that. Maybe they've cast more of them since. Well, here's just a photo shoot of famous bells. Here's the peace bell at Hiroshima, a peace bell in Australia, peace bell at Valley Forge, more peace bells. Okay, going to a different kind of bell, handbells. Now, handbell, how many of you have played in a handbell choir in church or in school? Or no kidding. Oh boy. Well, they're very popular. They're lovely musical instruments. I only brought one here to show you. I didn't bring a whole case of them. They got a very pleasant sound, and you get a 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 octaves of handbells in a choir, and there's lovely music that are written for it. And I did some consulting with the Malmark handbell company, and I had written down here that Jake Malta, the owner, said that he estimates 40,000 handbell choirs in the United States alone. And there are many very popular in Japan. There are handbell choirs all over the world. Well, handbells date back at least several centuries. Although tuned handbells were developed in the 18th century, presumably the handbells with English tuning were developed in order to give tower bell ringers something to practice on. I'm going to briefly, I hope, got to watch the clock, introduce you to change ringing, such as practiced in all over the UK. And these tower bell ringers, who were really serious people, wanted something to practice on. So the English handbell tuned handbells came into being. Now in the United States, there's more playing by handbell choirs. Now most handbells have one overtone tuned to 3 times the frequency of the fundamental. I think you can probably hear it with this bell. You hear the 12th, yeah. Now there are other partials that are pretty much harmonic, but those are the principal ones. We'll talk about that in a moment or two. Well, here's a periodic table for the other side of the classroom with handbell modes. Now you notice the modes are somewhat alike. The lowest mode of the handbell, like the lowest mode of the tower bell, carillon bell, is the 2-0 mode, has 2 nodal meridians. And then you have a group 1 that has a circular node, and a group 2 that has a circular node down by the sound bow, and so on. So they're quite a bit like the large church bells. One of the ways that we found convenient to study the modes of handbells, after you can bring those in the laboratory, which you can't do with large carillon bells, was using holographic interferometry. And you've probably seen me show holographic interferograms of a large number of musical instruments. You use laser light, of course, because you need two beams that are coherent, and you split the beam, and one beam goes directly to the object you're making the hologram of. Here, I guess I've shown a guitar. The other beam goes to the detector. Now, in the olden days, that detector was fine-grained photographic film. So we got scattered light from the object and the reference beam reaching the photographic plate and interfering with each other and giving us interference patterns that could be re-illuminated by the laser light and would give you a map of the modes of vibration of the bell in 3 dimensions. Well, I don't have a 3-dimensional depiction, but I've got photographs. Then you can photograph the 3-dimensional interferogram and get map of the modes of vibration. So the bullseye represents the point of maximum amplitude, the antinode, whereas the white lines represent the nodal lines, because when you time average the hologram, the bell sort of pivots on the nodal line, and so that shows up the brightest. The cap up here, where it's fastened, doesn't vibrate at all. But in the antinodal region, you get an interference pattern that you can tell exactly what the amplitude is. In the geometry that we used, each dark fringe or bright fringe represents an increment in amplitude of 1/4 of an optical wavelength. So these patterns are taken at low amplitude in the linear region of vibration, but they give you an accurate mapping of what the bell does. Well, here, yeah.
I'm just curious about the degeneracy of those nodal lines. I guess it depends on your excitation point where those node lines form, and if you move around the rim, they'll move with you.
Mm-hmm.
And does it work if you excite it in 2 different angles? Will you get a superposition of those nodal patterns, just linear superposition?
Yeah, you can. You now in our favorite scheme for excitation was to attach a tiny neodymium iron magnet and then use a coil with a current from an audio oscillator. So we applied a sinusoidal force at one frequency. But
position along the rim.
yeah, but you could have we could have interlocking modes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. A non-unique basis.
It would be harder to interpret them because you'd have twice as much stuff on there. All right, here's again a familiar graph, modal frequency versus the number of nodal meridians, frequency versus the number of nodal meridians. This is a large handbell, a G2. This is a C5, a little bit smaller handbell. And you notice an interesting thing that's a bit different from the church bell is that the M1 family, the one with one nodal circle, comes down in frequency, reaches a minimum at the 4-1 mode, and then starts back up again. And that's tied up in the fact that you actually got a little bit of a stretching of the bell metal in these modes. And of course, stretching the bell takes more energy than just flexing it, bending it. And so you get a minimum. And then the M0 family stops, and then it picks up again with the M1 star family. It's almost as if that's a continuous family. And that break from going from M0 to M1 star occurs at the same value of M as the minimum in the M1. It's kind of an interesting, well, you know, it's one of those things, you find that out and then you sit down and try to figure out why it's so. We can come up with a plausible reason why that's so. I won't go into that in detail. Another way that is we've studied modes of vibrating systems, be they drums or be they bells, is by experimental modal testing. Now, some of you may have encountered this in a mechanical engineering class. You put a piezoelectric crystal, a load cell, on a hammer and use that to excite it. So you get an electrical output that's proportional to the instantaneous value of force, to force as a function of time. And you Fourier analyze that and get the force as a function of frequency. Well, then you attach an accelerometer at one point in the structure, and you also get an acceleration as a function of time, and you Fourier analyze that. You use a dual channel FFT, and you get acceleration as a function of frequency. And you divide acceleration by force then, and you get the transfer function. You get the, well, acceleration over force would be the, what's the opposite of stiffness? Compliance. And you plot that. And you let the computer sort out all this data. You strike it at, maybe 100 points on the structure. And you tell the computer each time the coordinates of the place you struck it. And your computer program, you know, computers aren't very smart. They're not electronic brains, but they're awful good at sorting data, right? And so the computer goes through all this data and makes graphs for you. So these are graphs of the modes of vibration. Now I've got this on a tape too. I can show that to you in motion, but these are just frames from the resulting structure showing these same modes. Well, what about the sound radiation from a handbell? Well, now that's kind of interesting. You get a multipole radiation. You know, we have you can divide up radiation into monopole, dipole, quadrupole, and so on. You get multiple radiation from the 2-0 and 3-0 modes, because the handbell is changing from circular to elliptical to circular to elliptical the other way. And so the sides are radiating outwardly. So the 2-0 will give you a four-fold pattern, and the 3-0 will give you a six-fold pattern. But now when we made a graph of the radiation, or when we studied the radiation, we were very surprised to find out that there's another type of radiation. Now this direct radiation from the sides of the bell goes up with the frequency. But we found another type of radiation that went up quadratically with it. And that is a parametric process. You know, if you probably learned in a ninth grade geometry class that if you have a certain amount of fencing, the way you can fence in the most area, most field is to use a circle, right? And so the circle going to an ellipse decreases the area, and then it goes back to circle, ellipse in the other direction. So the area of the mouth changes twice per cycle. And so what it does is blows air out when it's losing area. It's losing volume, you see. So it blows area out at twice the vibrational frequency. And since it's quadratic, that has a steeper slope. Here are principal partials of handbell sound now along the axis and at right angles to the axis. You might even be able to hear that certainly in the anechoic room you would. The direct radiation, and here's the parametric radiation. Can you hear that an octave higher? And that change has a different angular dependence than the direct radiation. That was unknown to the handbell makers, and they found that rather interesting, that you could actually get, in addition to the partials that we know radiate directly, you could get octaves of those partials radiating strongly. Here's a graph of radiation versus the angle. You see that you've got a 2 theta and a theta component. Well, one of the things that, handbell choirs got bigger and bigger, so handbell manufacturers wanted to make a larger and larger span of handbells. The trouble is that these very large bass handbells radiated very weakly. And the reason for that is that when you've probably run across the coincidence frequency in connection with room acoustics when you're looking at the transmission through walls. When you get to a point where the a flexural vibration travels at the speed of sound, then essentially the sound radiation short circuits it and the radiation drops. That gives you a dip in a flat wall plate. But it also gives you a dip in the radiation efficiency of a handbell. And so these low modes of vibration in these large bells were very weak. Well, okay, one way you can improve that is to use a material with a faster speed of sound, like aluminum. And so we suggested that to the Malmark people. Why not make the lowest octave of these bells of aluminum? That has the additional advantage in that it's easier for mere mortals like this guy to handle the bells. They're not as heavy, and they radiate more strongly. Now they Malmark routinely makes the lower octave, or even 2 octaves if the customer wants, out of aluminum. We call them enhanced bass bells. Well, here's another bell. I won't go into this in detail. These were taken, I acquired a real cowbell in Switzerland and brought it back to the lab, of course, and studied modes of vibration of it. All right, now we turn to a completely different kind of bell, some ancient Chinese 2-tone bells. And just going back to, if you have a circular object like this glass, water glass here, I can tap it at any point and get essentially the same pitch. Not so with a coffee cup. I've got 2 tones. And the reason is the mass of the handle has broken the circular symmetry. And so anything on the handle or 90 degrees away from it vibrates at a slightly lower frequency than in between. Well, a couple thousand years ago, the Chinese knew about that. Now, whether they were coffee drinkers or whether they just, or maybe it was a grain scoop, or maybe they just hit on it. But these almond-shaped, pointed oval bells have that same property. You hit them, or a larger bell. And they discovered it by design or by chance and made large carillons or large sets of these two-tone bells. And well, these go back to the time of Confucius. They're very prized in Chinese archaeology. And we had a chance to participate in some studies of these two-tone bells in China, and also studied them at the Smithsonian, where they have a fine set of them. This is probably the most renowned one, the Zhonghuiyi, the set of bells, 65 bells, I think, that were buried in the tomb of the Marquis of Zheng. And they were accidentally discovered and excavated in 1978. They date back to 433 BC, or BCE now. And they're very lovely bells, a lovely sound. They're well tuned, but they all have this two-tone, and they know how to make use of that in music. In fact, each of these bells is inscribed with, it was a real find for the musicologists in that it told the name of the note that bell sounded, and so it provided a Rosetta Stone really for studying the ancient Chinese scales, or lu. And in 1988, they had a symposium commemorating the 10th anniversary of the excavation of them in Wuhan, in Hubei province. And they invited bell aficionados from around the world to attend and present papers, to discuss bells, and I was one of the fortunate ones that got to go to Wuhan and listen to them. In fact, one of the exhibits here, and I hope after I quit talking that you'll come up and browse a little bit. One of these was a book with all the papers presented at that symposium. In fact, it was published in English and in Chinese. The papers were translated so that all the papers existed in both languages. I brought the English one. I didn't bring the Chinese one. I've got a copy of that too. But this was a very, very interesting symposium. And as a result of that, I met a lot of the Chinese bell aficionados, scientists, and got to study several sets of these bells in the Shanghai Museum. And then after coming back to this country, I got a chance to study a bunch of bells, a set of these in the Smithsonian, in the Sackler Gallery. Have any of you been in the Sackler Gallery? It's where all the Chinese and Oriental art is housed. Oh, it's a marvelous gallery. It's one of 16, is it, galleries at the Smithsonian. And Dr. Jenny So, who is the curator there, was in the process of writing a book about the Sackler bronzes. Well, I should tell you just a word about Sackler. Dr. Sackler was a physician in New York that made quite a lot of money by discovering Valium, I guess. And then he invested that in medical publishing and made even more money. But he was an ardent collector of Chinese art, and especially Chinese bronzes. And he made quite a few trips to China and to, well, Hong Kong especially. After the Second World War, there was a lot of priceless Chinese art that had been smuggled out of the country and you could buy on the streets in Hong Kong if you knew what you were doing. And he was enough of an expert to know what to buy and what not to buy. So he accumulated a very, very fine collection of Chinese art, especially Chinese bronzes. And he built a gallery for them at the Smithsonian. The Sackler Gallery is the foremost Oriental art gallery probably in this country. And Dr. So had studied these and had published already a volume on the Shung Dynasty bells, and she was working on this one on Western Zhou Dynasty bells. And she invited a art historian from UCLA, German fellow, Werner von Falkenhausen. If you want an entertaining lecture, get Werner up here to talk about the ancient Chinese bells. Well, anyway, in this, there's a 3-volume set on the Sackler bronzes. This is the one that has a lengthy chapter that Werner and I wrote on the history and the acoustics of the Sackler two-tone Chinese bells. Well, okay. If we tried to make a diagram showing the modal shapes of these Chinese bells, there'd be twice as many as there would in a bell with circular symmetry. Because, for instance, the 2-0, there's one where the nodes are here, and then there's one where the nodes are where the antinodes were in this. They're a complementary pair. We call this the Chinese term is the sui and the gu set. So every one of these modes that you saw on the periodic table of the church bells and the handbells is doubled. But for comparison, here's the church bell and the handbell that you saw before. This is a photo of yours truly doing some experiments at the Sackler Gallery at the Smithsonian. I had a whee of a time at the Smithsonian. Of course, I couldn't touch the bells, but they had a technician with white gloves that brought them down one by one, and we could record them. I couldn't make holographic interferograms of them, however, at the Sackler, but on one of my trips to China, I visited the Suzhou Music Instrument Factory, and I bought a copy, I guess a Chinese copy, is that what you call it? And that's where this one came from. This is from the Suzhou Music Instrument Factory, and it's a copy of the. And this one, as you heard, has a minor third interval between the A and the B tone. And in fact, we made quite an extensive study of all the published bells, all the recorded ones we could lay our hands on, and everything to see what the musical interval was between the A and the B tone. And it was, here's the familiar diagram with the frequency and the modal number of modal meridians M. And you see each one on here is a doublet. Here's the 20B, here's the 20A. So there's twice as many modes as there was on the one of handbells or church bells. Well, these are a series of graphs now showing the interval between the A and the B tones on the Zhenghui bells, that renowned 65 bell set from Wuhan. And there's quite a bit of scatter. They tend to cluster around the minor third, 1.2 ratio, and a little kind of a sharp major third. So we set about to try to determine, whoops, and I'm not going to be able to tell you quite the whole story in 2 minutes. How is the interval between the A and the B tones determined? By the eccentricity of the bell? By variation in wall width, or other? And so we tried all these different schemes. And let me close with one more type of Eastern bell. After making these magnificent two-tone bells for several centuries, the Chinese got tired of them, I guess, and started casting round temple bells. Well, I guess that was probably the time that Buddhism arrived in China. And so they made large circular bells. And these are several bells that I've photographed in the Great Bell Temple in Beijing. Have you been at that place? That's a must for bell aficionados. In fact, the largest bell there is the Yongle bell in the Great Bell Temple, which weighs 45 tons and is 5.5 meters in diameter. And these are the modal studies of that. I didn't do those. Scientists at Peking University in Beijing studied those. But I did have a chance to study a number of bells in Korea. And so here are Buddhist round large bells from Korea and Japan and China. Now the Korean ones have an additional twist. They have a chimney on the top of them. Here's a model of one of the Korean bells. It has a chimney up here. Yumtong, I guess, is any Koreans in the audience? That's a very interesting feature that I discuss in the book, but I won't have time to talk very much about today, because I want to close with, if you'll grant me 2 minutes for an epilogue. Ringing the bells. Now, ringing different types of bells in various ways is a very interesting application of musical technology. Take that away from this lecture if you forget all else. Carillon bells are played from a clavier, a keyboard, by means of levers and cables. And if you haven't been up in the Hoover Tower and seen the carillon, please do go up there and look at it. It's a magnificent musical instrument. Now, Professor Timothy Zerlang in the music department is the current Stanford carillonneur, and he teaches a course, Music 172F in carillon. You can sign up for it and learn to play the carillon yourself. Unfortunately, and I've told this to Tim, that he really doesn't play it nearly often enough. You can go to Berkeley and hear their carillon played almost every day of the week, but the Stanford carillon is played only on special occasions like commencement. Stanford's first carillonneur, James Angel, was a professor of electrical engineering with whom Zerlang studied. Herbert Hoover, a fellow engineer, reportedly welcomed him to Stanford. A little bit of history. Now, one final type of bell ringing that I'd like to whet your appetite is change ringing. Now, change ringing is a way of ringing church bells or handbells that's especially popular in England. If you've traveled around the countryside in England on a weekend, you can hear bell ringing at the country churches. In fact, many of them are bell ringers from London that have come out to ring some of these country bells. What lovely bells. Many persons have learned about change ringing through reading Dorothy Sayers' novel, The Nine Tailors. Have any of you read that? Recommend it. Change ringing can also be done on handbells, and I would be happy to introduce Carmelites to this delightful hobby. I have a set of handbells and a set of 8. It's better on handbells, I think, to ring 2 in hand. So 4 ringers with 8 handbells makes a very, very nice sound. And if any of you are interested, I'll be glad to bring my set of handbells in. And all I ask is that you, if you start, you keep it up. And we could have a lot of fun. In fact, I did, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago, I had a group that started, but they didn't really stick with it long enough to become hooked completely on the handbells. But I'd be glad to teach you the fine art of change ringing. It's really a partly music and partly mathematical. The object is to ring the handbells in all possible orders, and there are rules for the changes and so on and so forth. But it's a rich heritage of ringing. And finally, the way that these large temple bells are rung is usually with a wooden log that's on a rope and swings into the bell. You've probably heard those. Well, thanks for your attention. I'll be glad to stay around and answer questions, or you can play with the toys, browse the books, whatever. Thank you.
Talk focused around these Eastern and Western bells. I was wondering, I don't know any examples of, sort of exemplary bells from like other like South American bells or like African bells, or I don't know if you've come across any sort of standout examples that are surprising from other cultures.
Well, my Western bells are from the UK and the United States primarily. Oh, and the Low Countries, of course. The Holland and Belgium, where the carillons really originated. My Eastern bells were from China, Japan, and Korea, but there's a lot of bells. And now there's a very fine bell in Myanmar and Burma that I've never heard. I'd love to go over there and hear that. But
not the one that submerged and broke, was it?
It didn't break.
It didn't break.
It sunk, but they got it up. Yeah, it's in a temple over there. Let's go, huh?
Yeah, let's go. Yeah, they have problems. What's the story? That one was being.
That was on a barge, I guess.
Carried off by the British, or?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know who had it. Maybe.
And then the Moscow bell, Napoleon tried to get his troops to move, but they wouldn't have any of it.
The Tsar Kolokol?
Yeah, the big one, yeah.
You know, that was broken when it was cooling after casting, by the overzealous fire people. At least that's the story I get.
Yeah.
But
well, they were in pretty bad shape by then.
I've traveled far and wide and seen lots of bells, but there's an awful lot of bells in the world that I haven't seen.